at least 700,000, situated in over 120 settlements, suburbs. So we have two distinct racial groups. One racial group has committed serious inhumane acts against the other racial group. And it's very clear that this racial group, the Israeli settlers, are determined to systematically oppress the Palestinian community in the occupied Palestinian territory. I think it's important to ask the question whether the situation in Palestine does resemble that of apartheid South Africa. I was Special Rapporteur on human rights in occupied Palestine for some 7 years. And so I've seen the situation at first hand. And it certainly reminds one very much of South Africa. I always had a clear sense of déjà vu whenever I visited Palestine, because we have all the features of apartheid as it was practiced in South Africa. We have territorial fragmentation. The Palestinian territory is divided into three groups: the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, and then there are subdivisions. So there is distinct fragmentation. There's a land grab. The Israelis have extended control over large portions of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. They forcibly displaced the Palestinian population in order to construct settlements and to transfer settlers into the Palestinian territory. They've established a so-called, or built a so-called security wall within Palestinian territory that in effect seizes 10% of Palestinian land for Israel. They have destroyed many of the Palestinian communities in the West Bank by destroying houses and forcibly relocating people. It's important to stress that house demolition has become a cardinal feature of the occupation. Then we have the equivalent of the pass laws. Palestinians require permits to travel everywhere. Checkpoints monitor this travel. And we have the same sort of humiliation that we experienced in South Africa following the implementation of the pass laws. Then we have segregation, obviously. The Jewish settlers live in distinct neighborhoods which are far more luxurious than anything in the Palestinian community. And of course, there's discrimination on social and economic grounds. Then when it comes to enforcement, we find that the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, implement and enforce the system more vigorously than the South African security forces ever did. In South Africa, we've seen extreme brutality displayed by the Israeli forces in Gaza in 2009 and 2014, and more recently in the action against the Great Return March from Gaza. So one has all the features of apartheid South Africa in Palestine, and this does, to me, seem to fall clearly within the definition of the crime of apartheid. The next question I want to raise is, what has the United Nations done about this situation? The Security Council is powerless to act because of the United States veto. Hardly any serious resolution has been adopted by the Security Council on Palestine because the United States over the years has vetoed any such resolution, and today, with President Trump in power, the prospects of the Security Council taking any action are zero. The General Assembly has fared little better. It has adopted resolutions. Most important, perhaps, is that it has recognized Palestine as a state. But the resolutions adopted by the General Assembly fall far short of those adopted by the General Assembly in respect of apartheid in South Africa. The General Assembly annually adopted resolutions imposing economic and diplomatic travel sanctions on South Africa and an arms embargo in particular, but that has not happened in the case of General Assembly resolutions on Palestine. So the United Nations really has been a major disappointment. And let me add that when I was Special Rapporteur, what troubled me most was that there were senior members in the UN Secretariat who clearly felt very loyal towards Israel and made no secret of their determination to support Israel and not to allow action to be taken against Palestine. As to the future, I tend to think that there are two ways of approaching the subject. First of all, there's the possibility of the International Criminal Court determining that the situation in occupied Palestine is indeed an international crime, that it constitutes a war crime and a crime against humanity and the crime of apartheid. This will be a serious blow to Israel. At present, as I've said, the International Criminal Court is considering this matter. The court is unfortunately under pressure from a lot of member states of the International Criminal Court not to take action. Of course, there are the usual suspects, such as Australia and Hungary, and even Germany has tended to side against Palestine before the International Criminal Court. But there is still hope that the International Criminal Court will take action. I think that's a very important step in the right direction. The other important form of action to be taken is by means or through BDS, because there's no doubt that BDS has succeeded in delegitimizing the state of Israel in respect of its actions in Palestine. And this is something that is of great concern to the Israelis, and it's manifested in the response of the Israelis. The only response Israel really has to BDS and to the prospect of the International Criminal Court finding that Israel has committed an international crime is to raise the argument that any action taken against Israel or any words spoken against Israel amounts to anti-Semitism. This, of course, is absolutely ridiculous. But unfortunately, one finds that the Israelis and others have embarked on a program of calling on states to endorse a definition of anti-Semitism contained in the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance coalition, which in effect defines criticism of the state of Israel and its policies as a form of anti-Semitism. So let me conclude by saying, first of all, that apartheid is an international crime. I believe that it is very clear that it is practiced in occupied Palestine. The United Nations is powerless to take real action because of the veto of the United States in the Security Council, and that one hopes that the International Criminal Court will take action and that BDS will succeed in persuading international civil society that this is a cause that must be undertaken with great enthusiasm. And finally, just let me repeat that it's essential that we resist all arguments that to oppose Israeli inhumane policies in Palestine is a form of anti-Semitism. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I think there's a lot of food for thought, and I'm glad people are engaging in the chat and raising questions, which we'll take after the three speakers. Thank you so much, Professor. Our next speaker is Nada Awad from the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies. So please go ahead, Nada.
Thank you. Good evening, and thank you very much for inviting us to present the work of CRHRS and our Palestinian partners at the United Nations, including presenting our joint campaign on apartheid. I would like to start by a quote that following the normalization of relations with Israel by several Arab countries, the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process stated that, I quote, "New avenues of cooperation to advance Israeli-Palestinian peace will emerge." And that was on the 26th of October. If history has taught us one lesson, it is that systems of oppression and domination are not overturned by the group in power, which benefits from impunity for its violations. These situations can only be overcome when there is a political will by third states and a principled stance and effective measures to bring to an end crimes being perpetrated. The situation in Palestine has been on the agenda of the UN for decades. However, describing the situation as a conflict that needs to be resolved by both parties, placed on an equal footing, is not only misleading, but a perspective that distracts from the fundamental root causes that are leading to the unjust reality, namely decades of Israeli settler colonialism, racial domination, and oppression of the Palestinian people. CRHRS, along with our Palestinians and international partners, have been working for years to advance accountability and international justice for Palestinians through the relevant bodies and mechanisms at the UN. Since 2019, CRHRS and partners have pursued a campaign calling on UN member states to recognize that the situation imposed by Israel over the Palestinian people as a whole is one of apartheid. And our organization have submitted a joint parallel report to the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, in which we called on the committee to recognize that Israel's regime of institutionalized racial domination oppression over the Palestinian people amounts to apartheid in violation of Article 3 of their convention. As mentioned previously, the Rome Statute defines the crime of apartheid as inhumane acts committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over any other racial group, committed with the intention of maintaining this regime. It is important to start with a historical overview of apartheid. In 1947, following the UN partition plan that gave Israel, the future state of Israel, 56% of mandate Palestine, while the Jewish population owned less than 7% of the land, the Zionist movement and its leaders were wary of the situation. They developed plans to ensure the desired demographic reality, which culminated with Plan Dalet of 47, which called for the systematic and total expulsion or ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people from the areas that would become the State of Israel in 1948. Under the directives of this plan, Zionist militias destroyed 531 Palestinian villages and 11 urban neighborhoods, expelled their population, leading to 80% of the indigenous Palestinian people becoming refugees. There has been no accountability for the crimes committed against the Palestinian people during the Nakba. However, since the establishment of the State of Israel, It has institutionalized the dispossession of Palestinians, adopting laws to legalize the expulsion and the expropriation of Palestinian property. Israel denied Palestinian refugees and displaced persons the right to return to their homes, lands, and properties, a right which Israel continues to categorically deny to this day. In contrast, Israel adopted laws such as the 1950 so-called Law of Return, which grants every Jewish person the exclusive right to enter Israel as a Jewish immigrant. The 1952 Law of Citizenship cements Israel's institutionalized racism in law, and it confers a superior status to so-called Jewish nationality. It results in citizenship not being a basis for equal rights in the country. It also adopted laws allowing to legalize the expropriation of the properties of Palestinians who had become refugees or internally displaced. The 1950 absentee property law, for example, allows for the state that confiscated Palestinian property to make it absentee property, thereby stripping the Palestinians of their rights to land and their property. So what basically is the point from this historical overview is to say that since 1948, Israeli laws, policies, and practices, especially land and nationality, were designed to impose Jewish domination and oppression over the indigenous Palestinian people as a whole. Now turning to Israel's strategic fragmentation of the Palestinian people, which ESCWA recognized as being a main tool of Israel's apartheid. In 2017, the UN Economic and Social Commission for Western Africa found that Israel's strategic fragmentation of the Palestinian people is one of the main tools through which Israel imposes its apartheid regime. By dividing the Palestinian people into 4 separate geographic, legal, and political categories, Israel ensures that Palestinian refugees living outside of mandatory Palestine, the Palestinians living in the territory that became Israel in 1948, Palestinians living in Jerusalem, Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza, cannot meet, group, live together, or exercise any collective rights, in particular, their right to self-determination. Most recently, in 2018, Israel adopted the Basic Law, Nation State of the Jewish People, which enshrines in Israel's constitutional legal foundations that the exercise of the right to national self-determination in the state of Israel is unique to the Jewish people. So turning now to the campaign and the aims of our campaign and our objectives. The campaign places itself within the Palestinian struggle for self-determination. It aims at shifting the international discourse from a focus on the political solution to a struggle for rights, national self-determination, and is aimed at overcoming Israel's apartheid regime and settler colonialism. It also provides an important momentum to focus on the apartheid framework because the Palestinian struggle connects with worldwide struggles against structural racism. The objectives of our organization is to advance an approach that overcomes the fragmentation of the Palestinian people by addressing Israel's institutionalized regime of apartheid as targeting the Palestinian people as a whole, and not specific domains, or for example, Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza in isolation from Palestinians elsewhere. Apartheid is the overarching legal framework within which Israel commits its widespread and systematic human rights violations against the Palestinian people with impunity. The overall objective of Israel continues to be, as historically mentioned, to expropriate the land and to alter the demography by transferring Palestinians and favoring the creation of Jewish localities and the expansion of Jewish localities on both sides of the Green Line, in Area C, in Jerusalem, in the Naqab, to give just a few examples. Israeli institutionalized policies and practices range from the denial of Palestinian refugee return, the creation of a coercive environment driving Palestinian displacement, the revocation of residency rights, the denial of family unification, and restriction of freedom of movement. They can all be understood within the larger framework of domination and oppression, and within Israel's settler colonial strategy on which it was built. In order to maintain the apartheid regime, which is part of the definition set by the Rome Statute and the Convention, Israel imposes policies such as collective punishment, mass arbitrary detention, torture, and it silences oppositions to its crimes. So while recognizing that apartheid is interlinked to the history of South Africa and Namibia, it is necessary to highlight that apartheid is regarded as a crime against humanity according to the Rome Statute of the ICC, and has been recognized as an international crime since the adoption of the International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid by the General Assembly in 1973. Our campaign aims also at addressing incentive structure perpetuating the occupation and settler colonialism, with, for example, one of the tools is the UN database of businesses operating in Israeli settlements, which aims at ensuring that corporations do not perpetuate the situation of occupation, where businesses are not only profiting from, but their activities are also helping to maintain and facilitate human rights violations and abuses. And they contribute to the systematic denial of the fundamental rights of the Palestinian people, including their right to self-determination and access to land and resources. The publication by the Office of the High Commissioner of the UN database in February 2020, which listed 112 Israeli and international companies complicit with Israel's illegal settlements, is an important tool in efforts to ensure corporate accountability for crimes committed in Palestine. Turning now to civil society action at the United Nations, in the 43rd session of the Human Rights Council, under Agenda Item 9, which focuses on racial discrimination, which took place on the 16th of June 2020, CIHRS delivered a statement on behalf of 114 human rights organizations worldwide, urging UN member states to first recognize and address Israeli apartheid over the Palestinian people as a whole. Second, endorse UN CERD's 2019 concluding observations on Israel, which recognize for the first time that the policies of racial segregation and apartheid over Palestinians are on both sides of the Green Line. And finally, the organizations recommended the reconstitution of the UN Special Committee Against Apartheid and the UN Center Against Apartheid to put an end to this injustice. For a reminder, the UN Committee and Center played a pivotal role in documenting and mobilizing against the apartheid regime of South Africa. Also, I wanted to mention that based on the work of Palestinian civil society, there is mounting international recognition that Israel is imposing a regime of racial domination and oppression over the Palestinian people. Following the foundational study by ESCWA, we have CERD, we have special procedures and member states which heeded the call of civil society. Civil society welcomed the concluding observations which I mentioned following the review of Israel by CERD, where they recognized that the policies are not only policies of racial discrimination in the OPT, but on both sides of the Green Line, so over the Palestinian people in Mandatory Palestine. In June 2020, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Palestine warned that Israel's plan to further annex Palestinian territory would crystallize a 21st century apartheid, meaning that it would crystallize, it will not create. And that is very important to note. Also, 47 UN special procedures who are UN rights experts warned that the morning after annexation would be the crystallization of an already unjust reality. Two peoples living in the same space, ruled by the same state, but with profoundly unequal rights. This is a vision of a 21st century apartheid. In the 43rd session of the Human Rights Council, the delegation of South Africa welcomed the CERD concluding observation and said the CERD found in its December 2019 observations that the strategic fragmentation of the Palestinian people formed part of the policy and practice of segregation and apartheid. During the general debate under Item 9 in the same session, Namibia drew a parallel to its own historical experience under occupation and apartheid and said, "We remain steadfast in our pursuit to see increased concrete action towards the elimination of racism, racial discrimination, and related intolerances, including those under foreign occupation, such as Western Sahara and Palestine." In October 2020, during the 45th Human Rights Council session, while Israel attempted to silence a joint civil society statement by raising a point of order against the NGO speaker, in the Human Rights Council, both South Africa and Namibia explained in their rights of reply that the argumentation made arguments for the importance of the apartheid framework and the legality of using the apartheid framework in the UN Human Rights Council. Finally, it's very important to note that the Palestinian mission delivered a statement under Item 9 in last month, stressing the moral and legal obligations to fight systemic racism and legacies of colonialism and apartheid. It warned, I quote, that Israel continues to pursue an illegal policy of population transfer aimed at altering the demographic composition of Palestine through settler colonialism and institutionalized racial oppression and domination, thereby imposing apartheid over the Palestinian people. Under international law, third states have a duty to adopt effective measures, including sanctions, to bring this illegal situation to an end, and illegal situations arising from grave breaches to an end. To conclude, I would say that civil society played a pivotal role in dismantling apartheid in South Africa through increased recognition of Israeli apartheid and through mobilization. The same is possible for Palestine. If past experience has taught us anything, it is that human rights violations against Palestinians will continue so long as the root causes of oppression remain unaddressed. In this case, the root causes are settler colonialism and apartheid, and they need to be addressed to put an end to this prolonged injustice.
Thank you so much, Nada. I think you've given everyone a lot of food for thought, and I can see a lot of questions popping up in the chat, which is great. So now we will go to Zane Dangor, the last speaker, and then we'll start the discussion through the chat questions first. Zane.
Good evening, and thanks for hosting this discussion. I think that John and Nada spoke about the elements of what constitutes the crime against apartheid. I'll speak about some of the implications for states and other actors, if indeed there's a formalization of this in the UN system. But I think it's important just to quickly reflect on the differences between the South African and Namibian struggles and the Palestinian struggle. In global governance, there's sort of two sets of values that sometimes clash with each other in the negotiating processes and the decision-making systems. One is, led by attributes that we are linked to what we call power attributes, and that foregrounds economics and military considerations. The second one, which is about fundamental values, relates to issues such as positionality, ideology, culture, and positionality, especially moral positionality. The South African struggle and the Namibian struggle, for some reason or the other, was able to leverage the latter fundamental values quite effectively in the UN system. So the struggle against apartheid in South Africa and Namibia basically served as, some people call it a lodestar for multilateral solidarity against all form of colonialism and racism. You found a situation where the norms of international law intersected with mass political pressure to end apartheid and the occupation in Namibia. For example, in 1961, the General Assembly established the Special Committee on Decolonization. In 1966, the General Assembly declared apartheid a crime against humanity. In 1969, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racism was agreed to. In 1976, the International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid, the Apartheid Convention. In 1978, for example, Resolution 418 made compulsory the arms embargo against the government of South Africa. And that used to be voluntary before, from 1974 onwards. And in fact, in 1974, there was also a UN Security Council resolution to expel the apartheid state from the UN. This motion was vetoed by France, the UK, and the USA. So you saw a combination of international law that sought to isolate apartheid South Africa with an expectation by the UN that the various resolutions would be respected, together with broad coalitions of states from all regions of the world and civil society. And if you take that into account, you had a veritable global BDS movement against the the apartheid government. Even in places like the US, you had the African American lobby pushing the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act. So you found that the intersection between politics, political morality, and international law resonated with the struggle against apartheid in South Africa and Namibia. The question that we must ask is, can the struggle against occupation in Palestine mirror our struggle in South Africa and Namibia? And we can see, the struggles taking place in the UN. And as John has pointed out, the UN has for many, many reasons failed. We can think about the plethora of resolutions against South Africa, many of them which were not implemented, but key ones that were implemented and did make a difference. The situation with Palestine is slightly different. There are hundreds of UN resolutions against the state of Israel, including 225 Security Council resolutions over this last 7 decades. However, none of these resolutions, none, call for binding sanctions on the state of Israel, not even arms embargoes. Instead, you find unilateral arms embargoes leveled against the Palestinians. So, what we see is that international law in relation to Israel has taken the form of admonishment as opposed to effective countermeasures by the UN and the global community. So you don't have the kind of critical mass supported, critical mass of states supporting the kind of action against the situation in Palestine as we have had with the South Africa. And we need to ask, can this change? Can official recognition that the situation in Palestine breaches prohibition against the crime of apartheid change the nature of the international solidarity with the people of Palestine? I think that's critical. The elements of crime, I think, has been spelled out by John here, by Nada, but there's also been interesting papers written by Ilan Pape, and most recently by Advocate Michael Sfard, on behalf of an Israeli human rights organization. And Sfard in particular made the case that the situation and the actions in the West Bank in particular is in breach of the prohibition against the crime of apartheid. So if we take that together, and as John suggested, you have an ICJ opinion on whether there is a breach on the prohibition against the International Convention, and whether the ICC succeeds in using the crime of apartheid as a crime of humanity in its investigations in the territories of Palestine. If that is formalized, we have recognition in a very formal way, what is the implications of that? And that's where I want to spend some time on. The key issue for me that we need to look at is, if we find that there is indeed a case to be made, the major issue that emerges is what I would call, John spoke about the sources of law, the Convention Against Apartheid, the Hague Statute, but we must also add into the mix, treaties like the Vienna Treaty, although it's soft law, it's important, but also Articles 55 and 56 of the UN Charter, they're also important. But most importantly is that if it is found that the prohibition of apartheid has been breached by Israel, Israel is then breaching a peremptory norm of general international law, which is Jus Cogens. So Jus Cogens norms, and sorry, I'll use these interchangeably, as described by the latest report of the International Law Commission, which is the 71st report, reiterates the point that Jus Cogens norms project fundamental values and are hierarchically superior to other rules of international law and are universally applicable. The same report restates the understanding that no derogation from Jus Cogens norms are permitted except through modification by a subsequent norm of general international law. The ILC report reminds us that a reservation to a provision that reflects Jus Cogens norms does not affect the binding nature of that norm and also stresses that use slogans gives rise to obligations owed to the international community as a whole. This is known as obligations ergo omnes. The importance of this is that even if there's a reservation by a state to the Apartheid Convention, given that the Apartheid Convention is linked to a norm of that is non-derogable, it doesn't detract from the fact that even that state has an obligation to end a situation that arises from what we call an internationally wrongful act. Okay. So any state is entitled to invoke the responsibility of another state for a breach of use slogan norms. Okay, so South Africa, any state has then, if there's found clear, John Dugard's paper is accepted by the international community, the ICJ has made a formal determination that a breach of the prohibition against apartheid is the case in Israel. Any state is entitled to invoke the responsibility, its responsibility to ensure that that illegal situation is ended. So the dynamics begin to change. The ILC's conclusion 19 in its report, which is aligned to another ILC report on the duties of states regarding international wrongful acts, reads as follows, and I'll read these two elements quickly as is. States shall cooperate to bring an end through lawful means any serious breach by a state of an obligation arising from under a peremptory norm of general international law. And two, that no state shall recognize as lawful a situation created by a breach of an obligation arising under a peremptory norm of general international law, nor render aid or assist in maintaining that situation. The conclusions reached by the ILC in its 71st report was influenced by obligations related to non-recognition of international wrongful acts arising from decisions by, amongst others, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. This includes Resolution 276 relating to South Africa's then illegal occupation of Namibia. The ICJ held that there was an obligation on third-party states, an obligation to recognize the illegality of the continued occupation and not to condone situations that arise out of the act of illegality. So the fact that you have de facto situations on the ground, settlements, whatever, cannot be recognized arising from this interpretation. The ICJ echoed this report in its ruling on the Wall opinion as well. So, and we can discuss that perhaps in question and answer time. The ILC report also highlights that the Security Council resolutions not to recognize a situation created by a breach of the prohibition of apartheid in particular, and the obligation to respect self-determination. So there's a Security Council resolution on that. There's also a General Assembly resolution, I think it's resolution 3411, which is guided by the principles related to use slogans and calls for non-recognitions of the Bantustans created by South Africa in furtherance of what they call apartheid in violation of self-determination. So you see some strong resolutions linked to use slogans and prohibitions against apartheid emerging. So the annex of the ILC report suggests that the prohibition of racial discrimination and apartheid as a use slogan norm is a settled fact. That it's a use slogan norm is no longer up for debate. So if the situation in Palestine is indeed found to be one that breaches this norm, the implications for state action in relation to Palestine is significant. As indicated by the ILC report, states would be duty-bound not to recognize any situation that arises from this breach of the norm. In addition, states would be obligated to work collectively and individually to bring to an end the situation that arises from the breach of the norm, and states that a state or even an entity like a multinational corporation, and this is often debated because of the human rights architecture globally that sometimes does not make multinationals duty bearers, but it does state that a state in breach of the norm may itself be guilty of an international wrongful act through aiding and abetting the initial wrongful act. So if you are aiding the settlement processes and it's found to be in breach of the prohibition against racial discrimination and apartheid, you are aiding and abetting that wrongful act. So you can see how a formal recognition, and the emphasis on the word formal, if a formal recognition that the situation in Israel breaches an important international norm, which is non-derogable, that this shifts the agenda from what states can and should do, okay? Because it would shift the focus from endless peace talks to a global governance agenda that compels the international community to end whatever situations arise from the government of Israel's breach of the peremptory norm on the prohibition of racial discrimination and apartheid. So this is where the advocacy is so important. I think Nada spoke about the situation and the resolutions in Geneva, but we need to take it a step further. I think we need to look at to what extent can we get an ICJ opinion on where the breaches of an important US Kogan's norm has taken place. We should also look at how the international community can assist the ICC in its investigations, so that the crime against apartheid, which forms part of the crime against humanity, forms a core part of the investigation, and it should be a logical part of the investigation, not just war crimes and the other horses of the apocalypse that John has spoken about. So you can see why there's resistance too in the international community to this formalization, and why, as John pointed out, that it's not something that you can have a meeting on one day in the halls of the UN and there will be a formal recognition that this is taking place. There's going to have to be a process of discussion where the elements of crimes that John has pointed out and that Nada has pointed out and that people like Ilan Pape and others write about is presented formally, and an opinion is asked for by the ICJ, International Court of Justice. That means that you need a resolution in the General Assembly to refer it to the ICJ. Getting that resolution through is going to be a significant amount of work in and of itself. So just getting the UN to resuscitate the apartheid committee is not enough. You actually then still playing in the arena of soft law. And what we need is actually to move towards hard law instruments, which a formal recognition that there's a breach against the prohibition. And I stress these words, breaches and prohibition, because prohibition, breaching the prohibition against racial discrimination and apartheid is something that no country is allowed to do. That's what we mean by peremptory norms. So this is the challenge. You have a UN system where you have resolutions that talk about the human rights abuses, war crimes, but never goes far enough to label and tag the situation as one that breaches this very important convention and the very important peremptory norm. And so what would happen, fourth, is normative discussions like these need to take place. You need to have events in Geneva, in New York, in functional commissions of the UN that raises these issues that John has raised, that Nada has raised, but raise it in a way that leads to a situation where the ICJ is compelled to provide an advisory opinion, where that advisory opinion needs to test whether a prohibition against very important peremptory norm has taken place. And that will change the goalposts in terms of what states can and must do in the international community. I leave it at that. I wanted to talk also about the law of occupation and how the law of occupation should also be used a lot more forcibly. Unlike the prohibition against apartheid, the law of occupation is settled law. The whole opinion confirms this. And the act of occupation is not an accusation, it's a statement of fact. And what is the responsibility of states if they recognize an illegal act like an occupation, when in fact the rules of international law suggest that they cannot recognize situations that arise out of an internationally wrongful act such as this. I leave it at that and perhaps take some more issues in the discussion there.
Thanks so much, Zane, and all of the speakers. I think there's an awful lot of questions that have been raised and points that people want to speak to. We have so many in the chat that I think I'll take those first. Is it okay to take maybe 3 at a time, and speakers they're not directed to anyone in particular, so maybe if you want to answer, and if not, we can pass on. Is that okay? And then take 3 more. So the first one was asked by Irina, which was, is the nation state law essentially an apartheid law? So that's the first one. The second one I noted was from Sikuru Banjo, and that was, with the US complicity with apartheid Israeli states, the apparent near powerlessness of the UN and the continuous forcible occupation of Palestinian land, what is the prospect of achieving 2-state arrangements, and how soon or long do you think this is achievable? And the third question we'll take and then ask, get the speakers to answer, is from Ahmed Kaji. What is your opinion on these Trump brokered deals with Sudan, UAE, Saudi Arabia? So maybe we can start with those 3. If we go in the order of the speakers, but if you don't need to answer every single question if you feel it's unnecessary or you've been covered by other speakers. So if we start with John.
You want me to deal with the question about the nation state law?
Yes, if you start with that one, that would be great.
Yes, I think the nation state law clearly introduces apartheid into the Israeli legal system. Essentially, it provides that Israel, or that the Israeli people have the sole right of self-determination in the state of Israel. It's not really concerned with Palestine. And I think the difficulty that we have to face is that one argument is that apartheid applies in Israel itself, and the other argument is that a more serious form of apartheid applies in the occupied Palestinian territory. And I think it's important to keep those 2 apart, because the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction only over the question of apartheid in the occupied Palestinian territory. So I prefer to keep those 2 apart, but there's no doubt that the nation state law does go a long way towards providing for a system of apartheid within Israel itself. I think there's a second question related to the 2-state solution. Today, there are more and more demands for the abandonment of the prospect of a 2-state solution and the adoption of a 1-state solution, in terms of which Jews and Palestinians will work together in a single state of Palestine. I think for the time being, the international community is determined to insist on the 2-state solution, and that tends to be the scenario within which the international community works. Thirdly, the Trump deals with various states in the region, of course, has serious implications for the Palestinian people and for the state of Palestine, because it has always been the determination of Arab states not to grant recognition of Israel until the occupation has come to an end. And the failure of the UAE and Bahrain and now Sudan to comply with this requirement is very serious, because it does indicate that within the region, opinion is changing. Of course, this is the result of sheer blackmail on the part of the Trump administration. And one hopes that if a new administration does come into power, that this will be reversed. But I fear that one cannot expect too much from the democratic regime either in the United States.
Thanks very much, John. I don't know if Nada, you want to answer to that or to the other two. And we have quite a few questions, so we'll try to get through them all, so at least somebody can answer to at least one of them.
Very, very briefly on the nation-state law, just as I mentioned a little bit in the historic part, that the laws that established and institutionalized apartheid are not, it's not the 2018 law. There are all the laws about nationality, about property that led to establish this regime since the beginning, since the 50s. So the apartheid, the law, the basic law that is the nation state of the Jewish people, it enshrines it in the constitution, it gives it a constitutional value, but it does not create it. So this basic law not only speaks to the national self-determination, but it also speaks to settlements, which in this part, the Jewish settlement is set as a kind of national value. It says national value in the law. So this gives like a constitutional force to the expansion of illegal Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory. So in this sense, I think it's important to keep in mind that this law does not create the reality. It gives it constitutional value. And concerning the question of the powerlessness of the UN and the prospects of the two-state arrangement, I think this is very important because we're talking about a shift in perspectives. Until today, there has been the rhetoric of the two-state solution and states saying they are backing this solution, while in reality, there has been no action, no effective measure taken to counter illegal Israeli settlements in the OPT. So in reality, what we see on the ground is that there is no prospect of a two-state solution. However, the international community is keeping it as a rhetoric, which it pursues because it does not take real action, but keeps this as lip service to the law. And while the ICC has jurisdiction only over the OPT, I think for us it was very important at the campaign and the discussions we've had with our partners is to differentiate between the specific actors like the ICC that could only look into the situation in the OPT, but keeping in mind that the situation is over the Palestinian people as a whole, as well as for special procedures, for example, who could look into the situation, the Special Rapporteur mainly on Palestine, who could look into the situation only from the perspective of the occupied Palestinian territory, but keeping in mind that the framework is larger. And while recognizing that, we call on the special procedures, for example, to address this limitation, but recognize the larger reality. And on the normalization deals, well, it's mostly very disappointing, I think, to the Palestinians, but these are mostly geopolitical deals by states that have interests in these arrangements. But I would say that this is not a position of the peoples in the region, but the peoples in the region have no real voice as they are not represented in a way that they can take these decisions.
Thank you. Zane, do you want to answer to any of those three questions?
Maybe just to amplify what Nada has just said, I think the laws that entrench an apartheid system has always been in place. And what we're seeing is you're moving from what used to be de facto to de jure forms of oppression, but they've always been there. You know, I think the absentee landlord issue, for example, has been there for decades. And this, for example, brings in again the elements of crime, the crime of apartheid that John spoke about. One of the key differentials is between prejudice and racism is prejudice and racism through law. And that is a key element of what the crime of apartheid is. So the nation state law, the fact that Palestinians need permits to travel in certain areas. They need to demonstrate that they have just cause to be in a particular area, which is akin to the past laws that we had in South Africa. So, these are part of the arguments one needs to make about this being a situation akin to apartheid in terms of the law. I think it's the question around normalization. If one again looks at it through the prism of the legal issues that I spoke about, if the normalization is seen as one that creates a veritable two-state solution, remember that the normalization is also about a slight shift in the historical approach to the two-state solution. It's about recognizing de facto that the settlements will remain, and that the rest of the land that is currently not settled illegally is up for negotiation. If that is what the normalization is all about, under a situation where there's formal recognition that the situation in Israel is one of apartheid, even those states accepting that would be acting in breach of international law. The kind of frameworks that emerges in the normalization debates would give rise to one state and one Bantustan. And that was given that's the language used by an Israeli NGO, saying that this is actually what would emerge if the Trump deal and the normalization deals come to fruition. But again, we must actually then look at what is the strategy? Do we campaign against normalization, or do we actually focus on getting a formal recognition of the situation, or do we do both? Because a formal recognition that the situation is one that breaches the prohibition against apartheid brings into question the actions of these states as well. And I think that's an important issue to recognize. The two-state issue, it may be rhetoric, but it's also very useful in the international community, where you can go to the GA and the Security Council, and in the absence of any other mechanisms, talk about the existing Green Line, talk about the pre-1967 borders, talk about the rights of an occupier, the duties of an occupier. And so the two-state solution, in the absence of anything else, provides a basis for argument against the worst excesses of the Israeli government.
Thank you. Thanks. There are an awful lot of questions. So there's 3 questions from Salim Valley and 2 from Judy Favish. So maybe I could ask all of those in one go, and then people can answer as they feel they want to. The first one is, why has South Africa not signed the Apartheid Convention yet? The second one is, does the Rome Statute definition of apartheid apply to Israel? And the third one is, should the UNGA label Israel an apartheid state, the UN General Assembly label Israel an apartheid state on the basis of those international law instruments? What should be done to ensure this? And then the additional 2 questions from Judy is, why are we not winning the argument that being anti-Zionist does not equate to anti-Semitism? And how do we build support against this argument? And finally, how many states support the call to label Israel as an apartheid state? I hope you've got those questions. And maybe, I don't know, John, if you want to start with the ones you feel you'd like to answer.
I leave it to Zane to deal with the question of why South Africa has not signed the Apartheid Convention. I have reason to believe that it is about to ratify the Apartheid Convention. That is long overdue. The second question relates to or it deals with the question of whether the definition of, or whether apartheid applies to the State of Israel in terms of the Rome Statute, as I understand it. And I think the answer to that is very, very clearly no, because the International Criminal Court only has jurisdiction over crimes committed within the territory of a member state. And in this case, the crimes were committed within the state of Palestine, which is a member state of the International Criminal Court. Israel is not a member state. And so it is impossible to institute proceedings against Israel for pursuing the policy of apartheid within Israel before the International Criminal Court. And that is why the ICC is focusing entirely on the question of Israel's actions within the Palestinian state by setting up settlements, by practicing apartheid, by carrying out war crimes in Palestine itself. Judy has asked the question about the equation of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. This is a very important question because I think the Israeli government is desperately concerned about the way in which civil society has turned against Israel in recent years. Governments may still be determined to support and to defend Israel, but civil society has changed its approach and sees Israel as engaged in apartheid and in unjust policies. And in order to combat this, Israel and its supporters have turned to the argument that to criticize Zionism or to criticize the policies of the State of Israel is a form of anti-Semitism. And that's a very powerful weapon. And I think one must just do all one can to distinguish between the two. Of course, it's nonsense to argue that criticism of Israel's violation of human rights in the occupied Palestinian territory is anti-Semitic. But there's no doubt that this label of anti-Semitism is very effective. It does mean that many politicians are afraid of confronting Israel lest they be determined or seen to be anti-Semitic. So like Judy, I'm very concerned about this. The final question was how many states label Israel as an apartheid state within the occupied Palestinian territory. I don't think any state is very clear on this subject. I think one has to accept the fact that today that states are very timid in condemning Israel as an apartheid state. Apartheid is a very pejorative term, and states are afraid of confronting Israel, and particularly they are afraid of confronting the Trump administration because the Trump administration has emerged as the major protector of the state of Israel. It's almost as if Israel is a member state of the United States Federation. Thank you.
I just wanted to add to two questions. In terms of the UNGA and labeling Israel an apartheid state, I think the idea from what civil society has been trying to do is to push states to recognize the reality. And what we have seen that is there has been mounting recognition, as we have mentioned, by UN committees, based on conventions like CERD or by special procedures such as the statement by the 47 Special Procedures of June 2020, but also of states. So recognition by South Africa was very important, also by Namibia. And this, I'm talking about the Human Rights Council here specifically, but also Palestine, Pakistan. There has been many statements in which there have been mention of apartheid. And maybe what for civil society is very important is to have this political recognition rising and building support for this framework. So I believe it's very important that we continue to build the narrative or build the framework, the legal framework, and continue to create, I think a lot of organizations are contemplating this framework, this legal framework, and creating more information and material and reports. So it's an important issue for civil society to take up with friendly states to start with, but also on the longer run, if it is civil society is able and successful to get legal positions, such as mentioned previously by the ICJ, etc., it would become easier also to compel other states to adopt this legal analysis. In terms of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, I think this has been an argument that has been used a lot by groups that are Zionist groups operating on different levels. And the only thing that civil society can do is to speak facts, to speak about what is really happening on the ground, and oppose these presentation that anti-Semitism is what is here the problem. The problem here is that since the creation of the State of Israel, there has been institutionalized racial domination and oppression. And this is what civil society is combating, and it's not religious in any way.
Thanks. Thank you, Nada. Zane, do you want to tell us why we've not signed the Apartheid Convention yet?
The first part of that, why we haven't signed it, we don't know. We don't know why we historically haven't signed it. When we got in earlier, I think last year, we asked why we haven't signed it and we couldn't get a cogent answer. So we are in the process of taking it to Parliament to ratify the convention. It's quite late, but I think it's important that South Africa does this. I think Nada has just underscore the point that Nada makes and John made. Very few countries in the national statements refer to the situation in South Africa, in Palestine as an apartheid situation. And the more countries that do that in their statements creates the kind of momentum towards an opinion by the ICJ. And that's where advocacy is needed. So you do actually need the kind of scholarly debates in the UN system led by states and NGOs about what are the elements of crime in both the ICC, in the crimes against humanity of apartheid, and also on the Apartheid Convention, because it has been neglected. And you had throwaway terms about apartheid-like or apartheid state, but I think the kind of legal, if you look at John's paper, you look at the paper written by Michael Schwab, these are very important papers that need to get into the international arena, needs to get debated, becomes part of a norm-making process, so that more states feel more comfortable about using it in their statements. I think there's the fear of the political backlash, but also a discomfort on, are we right on this? Is apartheid not something that was purely about, the South African and Namibian situations? And the more confident states become that, in fact, this is the international legal framework facilitates for an analysis of apartheid systems outside of its historical location in South Africa and Namibia. That is something that is key, and that many CSOs must take up as well.
Thanks, Zane. There've been so many questions that I'm afraid we've only got time for one more round. So I'm just going to ask a few of them. Some of them we have sort of covered kind of their areas, but I'll ask another one round and ask for the speakers to give answers and then maybe just to say a few summating words. So the next question is from Aziz, and the question is, what's the relationship between the various recent normalization deals and Israeli defense arms sales and interests in these from the various governments in the region? The second one is from Yusuf Chikti. Are drifting into an avenue of civic and human rights struggle with an apartheid focus important as it is, and abandoning an anti-colonial form of struggle politically? Surely they are two sides of the same coin. And finally, a question from Jeremy Phillips, who's asking, 2 or 3 weeks ago, the University of the Free State entered into a relationship with Haifa University. Do you think there are prospects for criminally prosecuting the University of the Free State in a South African court? So maybe if we start again with John, I think maybe the last question is something you might be able to give a few thoughts on.
Yes, well, the whole question of the academic boycott is a very difficult one. As you know, the matter has been debated recently in the University of Cape Town, and Cape Town was called upon to discontinue expressed relations with Israeli universities, but it decided not to do so. I think one must accept the fact that Israeli universities are to a large extent complicit in the occupation, that albeit indirectly, they do assist Israeli institutions in the occupied Palestinian territory. And in that respect, they can be accused of aiding and abetting the unlawful practices within the occupied territory. And I suppose one could argue that in South Africa, aiding and abetting an unlawful regime falls within as might be labeled as a war crime. But I think it's very unlikely that the South African prosecuting authorities will engage in such an initiative. I think it's, quite frankly, I've been a party to trying this, but it hasn't worked, so I'm not too optimistic.
Thank you, John. Nada.
Maybe just to say that I'm not sure I understood the question correctly, but I wanted to reiterate that what we have been trying to do in the campaign is to look at using the framework of apartheid in the context of the struggle for self-determination of the Palestinian people. So the idea of anti-colonial struggle and the struggle that is anti-apartheid are for us very related. And in this sense, I don't see as abandoning any of the two frameworks. And in relation to the normalization deals and definitely it is an important issue that is the issue of geopolitical interests and building a front against, between brackets, the axis of evil, etc. That is very important for the actors, and that is one of the main points advanced in these relations, but also they will entail, of course, a lot of security, cooperation, and exchange.
Thanks, Nada. Zane.
I think Yusuf's question is very important. If one goes through many of the resolutions related to Palestine, starting from some of the earliest ones, the word human rights is sparsely used. Human rights comes in when commissions appointed of experts appointed by the Security Council of the General Assembly makes commentary on the situation, and the words human rights come into it. But generally the resolutions have focused on the anti-colonial struggle without actually engaging on the human rights abuses on both sides of the Green Line, and that needs to change. The intersection between human rights, the kinds of elements of crimes that we've spoken about that we found in the apartheid situation is important. When I spoke about the political traction with South Africa and Namibia, it's because the campaign was also human rights centered. It wasn't just seen as an anti-colonial struggle, it was seen as a struggle for fundamental human rights. And the content of engagement needs to change and create the kind of nexus between anti-colonialism, self-determination, and human rights on both sides of the current Green Line. That will allow for more traction to be made to get member states to look at the Convention on Apartheid again with fresh eyes. So I think that's an important question, but it also is something that needs to be looked at, because in the political domain, it's almost seen as a clash of two nationalisms. And that brings into the interplay what Nada referred to as what people talk about, a conflict between two states, and it takes away from the asymmetrical nature of the occupation. So we need to infuse human rights language into the language of anti-colonialism as much as possible. I think all the other questions that were asked were dealt with. Yeah?
Great, thank you, Zane. I don't know if the speakers, if you have any last words you want to leave us with. John, just a few words to summate or for future discussion even, because I think judging from the amounts of engagement, we will be definitely calling on you all to have further discussions. John.
Let me be very brief. I think the big difference between apartheid in South Africa and apartheid in the occupied Palestinian territory is the fact that international law was taken seriously in the case of apartheid. The international community took the view that South Africa's policies violated important norms of international law in the field of human rights, and the international community took a long time, but ultimately it did succeed in ensuring that international law prevailed and that apartheid came to an end. The difference, as far as Israel is concerned, is that norms of international law support Palestine completely. International law, the state of Palestine rather, does premise its arguments on international law, and it argues that international law should be respected in the case of Palestine. But the international community simply ignores these international norms. And that is what, for me, is so depressing, that European states in particular, which have been so committed to advancing the cause of human rights in the international arena, simply refuse to do that in respect of Israel. Israel has become the great exception, the case in which normal norms of international human rights law simply do not apply. And that for me is very, very depressing. And let me end on that note.
Thank you. Nada.
Thank you. I just wanted to reiterate a couple of the points. The first one is that civil society work is, I think, instrumental in shifting the narrative and shifting the discourse on the situation in Palestine. And I think the role that was played by civil society in other situations, such as South Africa, shows that the role is pivotal, and it would allow the change. And I think there's much more awareness about the asymmetry of the situation, the fact that it's not a conflict, and all that is changing. So I see a lot of positivity in this sense coming from civil society. Another thing is that we are seeing mounting recognition, which is very positive, and it's coming from different actors and different states, and building on that, I am sure we can achieve a stronger hold and a stronger base for this work to get to a point where we are able to mainstream, but also have the political will for taking concrete actions, taking action that is possible, that will dismantle the apartheid regime if states do take effective actions against the state of Israel, whether economic, whether diplomatic, it will dismantle the apartheid regime in Palestine.
Thank you. Zane.
I just want to sort of re-emphasize what John said. We need to sharpen the debate and discussions around norms of international law and bring in the specific instruments that apply to the situation in Palestine in as much as it applied to South Africa and Namibia, and make those linkages. We need to talk about law, the norms that are non-derogable, and make states realize what their obligations and duties are in relation to possible breaches of prohibitions against apartheid in Palestine, in Israel, because this is not being done enough. I think the disjuncture that John spoke about is very important. Just like individuals in the international community, you have states that are progressive, except for Palestine. So you'll find states that will be quite supportive and progressive in most human rights issues, with the exception of Palestine. And similarly, and ironically, you also have states that are conservative in many respects, except for Palestine. And these kind of clashes don't actually help to build the kind of critical mass of states that will carry a resolution in the General Assembly that would be supported by more than 2/3, so that we could refer the issue to the ICJ. So more debates, more scholarly discussions like this in many settings is needed, and partnerships between states and civil society will be key.
Thank you. Well, I think we're really at the end of our time now. So I just want to thank very, very warmly Professor John Dugard, Nada Awad, and Zane Dangor. I think you've really given us so much food for thought. Also to thank everyone who participated and asked such pertinent questions that made such an interesting discussion. The issue isn't settled, and I'm sure we will be calling on you again. Also for us in the South African BDS coalition, we'll be taking what you've said and strategizing and hopefully working together to see how we can take this forward and push our government on these issues. I also just want to remind people that this is one of a series of schools. The next SABDS school will be on Palestine and the political economy. And I think some of the questions that were asked were pertinent to that discussion as well, where we can go deeper into those issues. And the last one in this series will be on culture and academic boycott. So again, some of the questions and the contributions will be relevant there. So I hope that people will use the bibliography that came into the email when you registered. Also to thank Elizabeth, she's put some very important links up as we're going through, because the idea is that we all need to keep reading and learning and talking and discussing so we can more effectively combat Israeli apartheid and put pressure on our government and organize in South Africa and in our continent to combat the strategy of Israel, particularly towards Africa at the moment. So thank you very much, everybody. With that, we'll say good night, take care, wear a mask, keep safe, and hopefully we'll do this again very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night, thanks. Bye.